Welcome to The Explainer. All right, class, take your seats. Today, we are going to get into what separates a truly game-changing decision from a catastrophic, company-killing blunder. We're going to look at the frameworks that great leaders actually use to make those choices that end up defining their entire legacy.
So look at this. On one side, you've got a single decision that created trillions of dollars in value and literally redefined how we all connect with each other. And on the other, you have these giants of industry who invented the future, but then completely failed to embrace it, which led straight to bankruptcy and total irrelevance. I mean, this is a story of two wildly different outcomes, and it all boils down to the quality of their most important decisions. Okay, let's dive in.
So, what gives? What was the difference here? Were these huge successes and massive failures just a roll of the dice? You know, a lucky guess by Steve Jobs and a really bad one by the folks at Kodak? Or was there something more deliberate going on? In this explainer, we're going to find out if these outcomes were really the result of a structured, repeatable process for making decisions.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll perform an autopsy on a bad decision. Then, we'll switch gears and analyze a truly great one. After that, I'm going to give you a practical toolkit of decision-making frameworks you can actually use. And we'll wrap up by talking about how to put all this into practice. Let's get to it.
Okay, first up, let's learn from failure. We're going to conduct a full corporate autopsy on a company that, for a long time, seemed absolutely invincible, Kodak.
Now, what's just fascinating and kind of tragic about this timeline is the huge gap between inventing the future and then being completely destroyed by it. Think about it. In 1975, a Kodak engineer creates the world's very first digital camera. At the time, they controlled 90% of the US film market. And yet, by 2012, they were filing for bankruptcy. How on earth does that happen?
This one quote, this says it all. It shows the mindset that ultimately led to their downfall. It's a failure of imagination, for sure, but it's also a sign of something much, much deeper. A complete and utter failure of process. So what was really going on inside that Kodak boardroom that made them bury their own world-changing invention?
Well, the answer lies in these predictable thinking traps, what psychologists call cognitive biases, that just completely clouded their judgment. You see, they weren't dumb. They were human, and they fell into mental traps that can get any of us if we don't have a solid process to protect ourselves from them.
The absolute biggest trap for Kodak was the sunk cost fallacy. I mean, they had poured billions, with a B, into their film manufacturing plants, all the chemical processing, the retail partnerships, the whole shebang. That huge investment made it almost psychologically impossible for them to look past those sunk costs and embrace a new digital future, even a future they themselves had invented.
All right, now let's pivot. Let's go from a company that was terrified of cannibalizing its main business to one that made it a core part of their strategy. It's time to deconstruct the decision to create the iPhone.
To really get what Apple did here, you have to transport yourself back to 2006. The mobile phone world was completely dominated by giants like Nokia and Motorola, and their phones were all about physical keyboards, tiny screens, and, making calls. Apple, at this point, had zero experience making phones. Absolutely none. And this quote just brilliantly captures their vision. Notice, Steve Jobs didn't say, "Today, Apple is entering the phone market." No, he said they were going to reinvent it. This wasn't about making a slightly better phone, it was about fundamentally changing what a phone was even for. I mean, this was a classic high-stakes, strategic decision, and it was unbelievably risky. But the biggest risk of them all? They chose to kill their own golden goose. The iPod made up 70% of Apple's revenue, and they knew the iPhone would make it obsolete. They just decided it was better to do it themselves before someone else did.
And the result of that massive, calculated risk? Well, over 2.3 billion iPhones sold, and a staggering $2.6 trillion in market capitalization, all built up from a base of around 70 billion. The payoff for making the right call in a high-stakes situation was, well, it was monumental.
So this brings us to the key lesson here, the core takeaway. The difference in mindset is absolutely everything. Kodak was obsessed with protecting its past, and it ended up losing everything. Apple, on the other hand, was focused on inventing the future, even if it meant destroying its most profitable product, and they ended up owning that future. Okay, now for the third part, your toolkit. We've spent time analyzing the why, so let's get you equipped with the how, because the real value here is turning these stories into a practical process you can actually use. This, right here, is the core lesson of our class today.
And here it is, the single most important idea I want you to walk away with. Research shows, time and time again, that having a structured process improves the quality of your decisions way more than just being smart. The folks at Blockbuster and Kodak didn't lack brilliant people. What they lacked was a good process. So for those huge strategic choices, like launching an iPhone, the rational decision-making model is your best defense against bias. It forces you to slow down and think methodically. Step 1, define the real problem, not just the symptom that's screaming at you. And step 3 is crucial. Evaluate your alternatives against criteria you set up beforehand. You see, this isn't about gut feelings, it's about disciplined analysis. And following this process is what separates a calculated risk from just a blind gamble.
But hey, what about when you don't have time for a big 5-step process? When you're in a crisis, you need the OODA loop. It was developed by a fighter pilot, so it's all about speed and agility. You observe what's happening, you orient yourself with the new information, you decide on a course of action, and you act. And then you immediately start the loop all over again. It's all about making the best possible decision you can right now with the info you have.
All right, let's bring it home with our final section, putting this process into practice. This is all about turning this theory into something you can do tomorrow.
Here are 4 simple but incredibly powerful things you can do this week. First, just write it down. The act of forcing yourself to clarify the problem and the criteria on paper is massive. Second, you have to fight that confirmation bias, so actively go looking for info that proves you wrong. Third, in your next meeting, officially assign someone to be the devil's advocate, to poke holes in the group's thinking. And finally, my favorite, the pre-mortem. This is a game changer. Before you go all in, you get the team together and imagine it's a year from now and the whole project has failed spectacularly. Then, you write the history of why it failed. I'm telling you, this simple exercise uncovers risks you would never ever see when you're caught up in the excitement of a new idea.
Look, at the end of the day, great leaders aren't just born with perfect judgment. They build it, piece by piece, through great process. They understand their own biases, and they build systems to fight against them. The quality of your life, of your career, of your organization, it's all going to be determined by the quality of your decisions. So the only question left is, how will you choose to make them? Thanks for joining this explainer.